Today we're here to talk about wildland urban interface fires. Those fires that happen outside of the cities, outside of the suburbs, in that area close to the forest or the wildland areas or the country, but not in the cities. These fires have given firefighters new challenges. We're not talking about fires in a city neighborhood where houses are very close together. We're talking about fires that are butting up against trees, country farmland, wheat fields. What I want to talk about today is just those fires. I want to give the company officer a little bit of information as he approaches those fires to look at them strategically, look at them tactically, and above all, look at them safely. To give them the information they need to know to successfully mitigate this problem. Well, these types of fires aren't new. They've been happening in Southern California and areas throughout the nation for years. What is new to firefighters throughout the country is the fact that areas within their states are having people move within to the interface areas. While I may work for a city fire department, that doesn't preclude the fact that the state that you work for, the agency you work for, may not send your company to a rural area of your state to deal with these fires. And more importantly for those city structural firefighters, this is a change. This isn't something that you've dealt with on a regular basis. So hopefully this presentation is going to give you those tools to understand what you're looking at, figure out your situational awareness, and deal with the problem appropriately. There's certain facts about wildland firefighters that happen in the United States annually. In 2013, the National Interagency Fire Center saw more than 47,000 wildfires burning more than 4.3 million acres. From 2004 to 2012, more than 13,000 primary structures were lost in the United States due to wildland fires. And according to the U.S. Fire Administration, in 2012, 9,326,238 acres burned in the United States. This is an area larger than New Jersey, Connecticut, and Delaware. Structural firefighters are being called farther and farther away from our cities into that wildland urban interface zone. We are seeing things that we typically do not see within our communities. We're dealing with a type of fire that is spread out over a large geographic area and not confined to a room and contents or a bedroom. So what firefighters are faced with in these types of fires are looking at what's happening way ahead of the fire and way ahead of where they're at to determine the appropriate needs and the appropriate tactics to deal with these fires. Firefighters are overrun annually by these types of fires, and good situational awareness and good information and use of good, strong tactics will keep your firefighters safe. One of the things I think is paramount to the success of dealing with these fires is situational awareness. We've learned this concept from our law enforcement partners over the years. Company officers are accustomed to dealing with a house fire in your cities where the situation is pretty small. It's confined to a room and contents, it's confined to the attic, it's confined to the roof, whatever. It's pretty easy to define your situational awareness. I believe you can't fix the problem if you haven't identified what the problem is. And on a wildland fire, before that fire ever gets to your structure or your subdivision or whatever, you need to define what is it doing. Is it moving slow? Is it moving fast? Is it being driven by topography? Or the fuels are dry? Or this is in light fuels or heavy fuels? Or what's the weather doing? Is there a storm coming over that's going to change the direction of the fire? The situational awareness is so much more important in a wildland setting because so many things will change the direction, the intensity, and the course of the fire before it ever gets to your structure. And you can't figure out what you want to do to fix the problem if you're not aware of what the problem is. Along with situational awareness, there's certain things I want the company officer to think about prior to arriving at the subdivision or the structure or the area you're going to protect. First of all, find out as much information about the fire. For example, the leading edge of the fire. How far is the fire from where you're at? In reference to the location, how long is it going to take there? How long has the fire been moving up to this point? Know the fuel, the weather and topography. Are you dealing with a day that has high temperatures, low humidity, and a 40-mile-an-hour wind, or is there no wind at all? Are you dealing with light, flashy fuels that are going to burn quickly with low intensity and move past you? Or are you dealing with heavy timber that's going to put a lot more heat in the way of your structure? And lastly is topography. Are you dealing with upslope fires, downslope fires? Is this in a canyon where it's going to limit your ability to get out if you need to? Is it going to have more fire intensity because of the topography? So keep in mind always, wildland fires, their intensity and their course are determined on fuel, topography, and weather. Are there maps of the area of the subdivision? Every community that we respond to or work in has maps, whether they're box alarm maps or whether they're city maps. Find out if you can get maps of this area. So you can look at the road system, where everything's at in reference to the fire. Also, if it's available, see if you can find any historical perspective maps. For example, has there been a fire in this area before? And if so, has somebody mapped that fire? Fires will typically in the wildland follow a similar course. And so if you have that historical perspective, it allows you to kind of get an idea of what this fire may do in reference to where you're at in your subdivision or structures. How much time do I have before fire gets here? I was recently at a fire where the fire moved 6 miles in one day. And the next day, it moved 1 mile all day. So depending on what the weather's doing, how much time do I have before the problem I'm preparing for gets here? That's good information to have. It'll allow you a better opportunity to define how much time am I going to give to each individual structures. Has there been a structural triage? Much like EMS, we figured out in the wildland community, why not go look at these structures within the subdivisions and see how defendable they are. Am I faced with a house with shake roofs, with cedar siding, with a 300-foot driveway lined with brush and trees? Is that a safe atmosphere or a safe condition for the firefighters? So has there been any triage done? Can we look at the area and say, I can save this one, I can do a little bit of work on this structure to save it, or I'm really going to need a little bit of time, or I can't do anything at all to protect this structure? A structural triage prior to your arrival will help. And if it hasn't been done, while you're there, do it. Many states and many wildland agencies are now using a standard wildland triage form. Is the area evacuated? Typically, evacuation is done by the local law enforcement agencies. But it's good for you to know this, and also know the laws within your state. If I'm evacuated, does that mean I have to leave? Can I stay? Can I say I don't want to be there? Or I want to stay there? If I am evacuated, does that mean I just can't come back once I leave? If somebody stays in their house after an evacuation order, am I responsible for making sure they're safe, or is that a law enforcement function? The other thing that you're faced with evacuations is, while these people are leaving their subdivisions with their vehicles and their belongings, you're moving into their subdivisions. And you've seen it on the 5 o'clock news, every time there's a large fire in one of these urban interface fire areas, that there's a big traffic jam. And so know that's going to be a problem. Know that's going to be an issue. You have people on foot, you have people trying to leave by vehicle. They're going to be in the way. You're going to have to figure out a way to work around that. And lastly, I want to touch on, as we're looking at the situational awareness, is the electricity shut off to the area? If I have overhead power lines running up and down the streets, and my apparatus is parked there or parked in a driveway, and I lose a power line, and now have I created an additional hazard? If those power lines fall, am I creating separate fires in advance of the fire that's coming to us? The other thing is, in rural areas of the country, people use generators. They use pumps to supply their water from wells. If the power is shut off, their well supply is no longer available. So that leaves it from the ability for you to use that water. You don't have that any longer. So we've talked on a lot of things with regards to situational awareness. A valid question is, where do I get this information? When I respond to a house fire in my fire district, I'm pretty familiar with the neighborhood, pretty familiar with the types of structures we have and that we're dealing with. But when I'm responding to somebody else's neighborhood or somebody else's fire, I don't have that situational awareness I do back at home. It's going to take a little longer. And where do you find this information? If I'm responding to mutual aid to another fire department, maybe the fire chief of that fire department, maybe county commissioners, maybe the people who do their GIS. You're always going to be working for an incident commander, whether it's a single person incident command team or you have a large management team. Don't start your job without a proper in-briefing. And that in-briefing says, I want you, it may be as simple as go up to the top of this hill and that's your subdivision and the fire's 5 miles away. And it may be a lot more complex where you're in camp and you get a detailed in-briefing of what's going on, what's happened prior to your arrival, and what's expected to happen. But either way, don't go into a fire situation without having some knowledge of the problem. Remember, it's one of the 18 watch-out orders. So where do you get this information, and when do you get this information? We talked a little bit about where, now when. If you're responding to your neighboring department's fire, your information may be received over the radio. It may be dispatched information from the local dispatch center that dispatches you as well as them. If you're responding across the state, there's going to be some check-in point. There's going to be some point where you enter into this fire system, the front door, if you will, of the fire, for all emergency responders to go through, to be identified, to be accountable, and to know that they're there. This is the time that you're going to get that information. There's going to be somebody there to meet you, whether it's a division supervisor or whoever. Maybe it's a task force leader that you're relieving, or maybe it's just a company officer who's moving out because they've been there for 3 days prior to your arrival. So you need to find out who that person is that's going to give you information. But once you check in and you're part of their fire, and you're part of their system, they're going to make sure that you have the information you need in order to do what you have to do. I've given you a lot of information about situational awareness, but situational awareness is so important for you to be able to do your job safely and keep your crews safe. We've seen it time and time again where people rush into a problem without taking a moment to pause, look at the situation, and then defining the best course of action to fix the problem. So I respond to a wildland fire, and they happen at night just as well as they happen during the day. And I haven't seen the subdivision before, I've never been there before, I know nothing about it, and I just go to work. Or better yet, I don't know where the fire is. Maybe it's closer than I give it credit for. Maybe it's farther away. You got to identify whatever hazards, and if you can't identify those hazards, then you don't know how to fix it. And lastly, with situational awareness, I want to touch on 2 things that are very important and helping you make your decision on how you're going to manage this problem. One is always keep in mind the 10 standard firefighting orders and the 18 watch-out situations. This information is available through any Wildland website, whether it's the Northwest Coordination Center or any one of the Wildland websites. You can find this information. Company officers need this. This is the information that the wildland firefighters have been using for years to check themselves, to make sure that they are watching out for these certain things. It'll keep them safe. And find out how they apply to your area. And then lastly, under situational awareness, what additional resources do I have coming? If am I a single engine response? Am I a task force? Am I a strike team? Am I a part of multiple strike teams within a division? How many resources do I have to deal with this problem? If I have a 50 house subdivision and it's just me and another engine, that's important information to have. How am I going to do the best for the most with what resources I have? So identify what resources you have available to you, and those resources may be air resources. Do I have air support? Do I have helicopters work in the area? Are there planes work in the area? Do I have wildland firefighters also working in this division that I could use to build handline around my structures? Or are they doing burnout operations that help maybe take some of the pressure off the structures or the subdivision? This information will be brought to you or given to you during your in-briefing or by conversations with your division supervisor. These situations are typically unfamiliar with those firefighters and those company officers that don't deal with them on a regular basis. You're very comfortable dealing with what's within your community and the dangers that are associated with those situations within your community. The problem with these fires is you may never have been to this subdivision before. You may never have been to this area before. So it's paramount that you pay attention to the 10 standard firefighting orders and the 18 watch-out situations and consistently review them throughout the course of your operational period to make sure that you are playing it safe and that you are ahead of the game versus falling too far behind. This presentation is going to follow a couple of lines of thought. And the first line of thought is structural and site preparation. What are you going to do to the area you're protecting before the fire gets there? We'll move into once the fire gets there and mobility and other things a little later. But let's talk a little bit about structural and site protection. Some of the things that the company officer needs to be aware of and needs to think about in preparing that structure to make it the most defensible as possible before the fire gets there. Sometimes this is going to be very quick and you're not going to have the time to do all of this because the fire's closer than you think. Sometimes you're going to be able to go through this list and then some because the fire's far enough away. But don't underestimate the value of site and structural preparation, because the more you can do up front to ready this structure for the fire, the easier it is going to be once the fire gets there to handle it and mitigate it. First thing you want to do is evacuate personnel and animals. I mentioned earlier that the evacuation of the civilians is typically up to law enforcement. And in a large-scale fire where they've had time to look at this before the fire ever got here, the law enforcement have put together evacuation plans and evacuation routes. And so your question may be nothing more than, has this area been evacuated? Secondly to this is animals. Most people will take their beloved pet with them, if it's a dog or cat and something like that. It's a lot more difficult to move livestock, horses, cattle, in the event of an upcoming fire. If the fire has moved fast and caught people off guard, what are we going to do with the animals? It's a question the company officer is going to be faced with. And one of the questions he can ask back is, do we have local animal control agencies who are able to take care of the animals? Some areas within the country have already identified the need to evacuate animals differently than civilians. And typically your local law enforcement agency is strapped when it comes to animal control forces. But a lot of these agencies and a lot of these areas have identified the need to move livestock, horses and things like that. And so they have a plan put together for this purpose. A lot of people will use veterinarians. They've come together with groups of people to move into an area for the sole purpose of moving livestock. Sometimes the best thing you need to do is get them out of the pens and let them go. And as a last resort, they can fend for themselves. But that's a question that needs to be asked and answered of the command structure, your division soup, whoever you report to, how best do you want us to handle the situation with the animals and livestock? The next thing you want to do in preparing the structure for the fire is remove all the combustible objects from around the structure. They may have cars parked there, boats, campers, firewood under decks, whatever it is that could carry the fire from that location to the house. And usually these are parked really close to other structures like barns, garages. Move it away from there. You want to get all of that combustible area or combustible objects away from those structures to allow the structure to survive on its own. Clear all vegetation around the structure. You may not have a lot of time to do this. And you got to look at what the problem is and look at what type of vegetation you have. I've been at fires where we've had the luxury of having heavy equipment, was able to move and remove that vegetation very easily. I've also been at fires where you have firefighters with Pulaskis and shovels and chainsaws, and it's very manpower intensive. But you need to move that structures. And in the wildland community, people who pre-treat their own homes remove this vegetation 50 to 100 feet away from the structures. And so whatever vegetation we can move away from that house or that building is going to better help that building survive. Once we've taken care of the outside of the structure, prepare the inside of the structure. Close the windows, remove curtains, closing interior doors to limit fire spread, turning off fans and coolers, air conditioners, disconnecting any gas lines or LPG tanks, leaving the electricity on, because you're going to want that electricity in case you need a pump or something like that that runs a well. Making sure that all entrance doors are open and unlocked. In addition, make sure there's a porch light on and a central light into the interior of the house that's on. So if you have to come back at night, you have visibility. Along with site prep and structural preparation, water is going to be very important. It may not be important right now, but an hour from now it's going to be really important. And so you may only have, based on the type of vehicles you use, anywhere from 250 to 1,000 gallons of water available on your apparatus. At the full force of the firefighting efforts, you're going to use a lot of this. I want you to keep in mind that this isn't like your downtown city fire where you have fire hydrants every 250 feet. The water you brought to the fire is what you have. You may be fortunate enough to be in a subdivision with a hydrant that you could easily resupply, but don't fall into that trap. So one of the things you can do in preparing for the fire before it gets there is take the homeowner's garden hose and stick it in the top of your tank. It's not a lot of water, but at 25 gallons per minute, that's better than nothing. Pre-treat the structure with Class A foam. I want to caution you here. A lot of times it's not available, but if it's available, try to figure out how long you have before the fire gets there. Are you going to put this foam on wet and have the heat and the time it takes for the fire to get there to degrade the foam and it's going to slough off the structure? Or are you going to put it on a real thick like shaving cream and coat the house? Okay? If you know that the fire's coming your direction and this is a tool that you can use, utilize it wisely. Don't do it too early and don't wait too late. And sometimes it's just as bad to put it on and not need it at all. And do I have the ability for extra foam? Can I do this for all of the structures? At 3% foam, you're going to go through a little bit of foam here. And so do I have a constant supply of foam in order to continue doing this? Foam is a great tool, but it's a tool that needs to be used wisely and appropriately. Ladder the roof. If the homeowner has a roof that you trust you putting your firefighters on, utilize it. Put it up to the roof. If they don't have one, then ladder the roof with one of your ladders. If you're going to be staying at the structure. Obviously, you don't want to ladder the roof and then drive away because you're retreating or you're moving on another house and leave your ladder there. And you don't want to take the time to deploy your ladder to your apparatus. But gaining access to the roof is going to be important, especially if you're going to have a fire that you have a shake roof where you may be able to carry the fire onto the roof. To get up to the roof and utilize some water up there to keep the house or the roof from burning is going to be important. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. If the structure has an electric generator, start it. Make sure that you have an uninterrupted power supply. If portable pumps or alternative water supplies are available, prepare them. Some homeowners are prepared in advance for these types of fires. Swimming pools are very good for other than just recreation on a hot day. If you have a 15,000 or 20,000 gallon swimming pool available to you, set up portable pumps. You may not need to utilize your apparatus at all, which may be a benefit to you in the event you have to leave quickly. So set up your pumps by the pool. Cisterns, 1,000-gallon cisterns and things like that where they have a water supply there. Look through your property, look through the area and see what water supplies you have and prepare those before the fire. They'll serve you well after the fire gets there. Close the garage door and disconnect the garage door openers. It's important to disconnect the garage door openers. Not the button, but the chain on the ceiling. Because once the fire comes by and if you lose power, you can't get back into the house through the garage door. So pull the chain, disconnect the garage door opener, and put the door down. If you need to get back in there, all you have to do is lift the door and not be worried about whether the power's on or off. Note all hazards, including power lines and septic tanks and certain terrain features. Is there a slope to the back of the house that's going to cause an upward slope fire to my structure? What other hazards do I have? Is there open septic tanks, or are there open wells, or whatever? Survey the entire structure to make, or the surrounding area around the structure, to make sure that you have no hazards that are going to be a problem for your firefighters in the event the fire gets there. Because remember, once the fire gets there, you're going to be concentrating on defending the structure, not looking for hazards. You're going to want to identify those before you ever have to deal with them. What about bridges? A lot of people in rural areas have culverts and canals and things like that for supplying water for their livestock and irrigation. And they'll put bridges over across these canals. Most of them, my guess would be, is they're not engineered bridges. So what's the weight of your vehicle? Is it going to be able to withstand the weight, or the bridge going to be able to withstand the weight of that vehicle? Roof-mounted satellite dishes. Anything on the roof that may become disconnected in the event of a fire and fall off and injure your firefighters. Or any other type of structures on the roof, whether solar panels, satellite dishes, or whatever, antennas. Identify those hazards, and if they're going to fall, you might want to secure them before the fire gets there. This all sounds pretty easy, preparing a house in case the fire gets there. But consider this. Resources are lean, and you're defending 5 or 6, 10 or 12 structures in the area. What I would recommend first is triaging all of those structures. Some of them, the homeowners have already prepared for you, and they'll be able to stand alone. Some of them are going to need a lot more work. Identify what structures you have within your protection area that you've been assigned, and deal with the ones that are going to need the most work first, and then move on. So up to this point, we've talked a little bit about preparing the structure for the oncoming fire, and what we need to do to make that fire more defensible. I want to move into now to talk about structural protection. We're now protecting the structure because the fire's on its way, or it's getting close, or we know we're going to have a fire problem. I've broken this up into several categories I want to talk about individually. First of all, there'll be apparatus positioning. Structural deploying your resources for structural protection. Mobility, your ability to move quickly in and out of that area. And then certain methods for confronting the fire at the structure. Then lastly, I don't want you to underestimate the value of a good exit plan. To get out of there when there's nothing else you can do, or you're faced with overwhelming fire potential or problem, and the safety of your personnel is at risk. Retreat is a good option. Continuing along our thought about protecting the structures, let's talk about apparatus positioning. You as the company officer sitting in the right front seat of your apparatus as you're heading into this area, this subdivision, or wherever you're going. Take a look at what the landmarks you have. Take a look at what hazards you may be faced with. What does it look around? What does it look like around that area you're protecting? What's the road system? Are these single lane, are these double lane, are these very tight dirt roads that you're positioning your apparatus in? Once you get there and you've determined where you're going to park and what structures you're going to protect first, back your apparatus into the driveway. Never pull your apparatus in forward, because in a retreat or in a position or in a time where you need to get out of there quickly, you don't want to have a spotter backing yourself out into the street. Back your apparatus into the driveway to allow you an easy access or egress out of that area. Park your apparatus so it doesn't block traffic. That seems pretty logical. We in the fire service block a lot of traffic. Much to the chagrin of our law enforcement partners, we will block traffic at all costs. Here's a situation where you really don't want to do that. And the reason why is if you've evacuated, they've called for evacuation orders, we don't want to block the people we want out of there. So put your apparatus in a position that doesn't hinder people's egress out of the subdivision as they evacuate. Avoid parking next to flammable vegetation or under power lines or near LPG gas tanks or other potential significant heat sources. That's just good common sense. I'm not going to park my apparatus next to a gas tank that may be a problem and may start venting or may light off or whatever vegetation that may be. Okay? look at where you're going to park your apparatus, and clear that, maybe you have to clear that area off first, or clear that area out first. Along with talking about the vegetation, you need to survey the area for hazards, such as septic tanks, wells, but more importantly, pay attention to hazardous materials. You're in the rural area. Farms are quite often using materials, insecticides, pesticides, whatever, in the daily operation of their job. Identify whatever hazmat, and I'm not talking about 1 or 2 paint cans. I'm talking about large containers or a significant amount of hazardous materials that you may find in the garage or the barn or in the house. You need to identify those. I'm not suggesting that you remove them. I'm just suggesting you identify them and are aware of what they may do in the event of a fire and how you may have to mitigate that. You may have to report to your division supervisor that you have a significant hazmat incident here or a potential for a hazmat incident, and maybe one of the resources they want to consider is a hazmat team to maybe remove that, all that hazmat right up front. After you surveyed the area, you determined you cleared off the vegetation, you know where you're going to park your apparatus. Park your apparatus in an area that's conducive to deploying your hose lines around the structure accordingly to what you're going to have to face and what you're dealing with. Okay? You're going to want your hose lines around to the back of the structure, to the leading edge of the fire, if that's the way it's coming. Review with your crews the maps of the area. As you take care of and you're parking your apparatus and you're getting ready, identify and communicate escape routes. This is important, and I can't stress this enough. In the event you're going to retreat and you're going to take the hoses, disconnect, and move out of there, make sure your engineer, your drivers are familiar with how they're going to get out of there. What's the best route to your safety zone? Because you're going to have a safety zone already identified. So what's the best way to get there? What's the meeting point for your personnel to get to the apparatus? And then finally, and you're going to do this continually throughout your operation, is monitor the fire's behavior. What is the fire doing? Have you expected it to come from the north and it's moved to the west? Consistently monitor that behavior. Take weather samples if you have the ability to with a hand weather kit. If you see the winds picking up or the humidity dropping, pay attention to that stuff. But always monitor that and do it regularly throughout your operation. We've arrived at the structures. We've done some pre-treatment. We've positioned our apparatus to start protecting this fire. Maybe we haven't had time to pre-treat the structure and prepare for it up to this point. We've just had to pull in and start dealing with the fire. We're now ready to deploy our resources to protecting the structure, which is the next category we're going to talk about under fire protection or structure protection. And the first thing the company officer is going to want to do is check their personnel for protective equipment, their personal protective equipment. And this includes fire shelters, and I can't stress that enough. All too often in the past, we've gone to wildland fires, and we read about it, sadly, in the news where wildland firefighters have had to deploy their shelters for their own protection. But we've never, and we haven't done a lot of that ourselves. Make sure you have a fire shelter for each one of your personnel, and they're in appropriate wildland or structural protection gear as identified by the problem. Next thing the company officer is going to want to do is brief their crew. Up to this point, you've been the one that's gone to the meetings and got the in-briefings and know what's going on. You should know more about the problem than anybody else. Take a moment to brief your crew and let them know what you know. This is not a time for surprises. This is a time for everybody playing on the same page. Review the lookouts, communications, escape routes, and safety zone principles, the LCES. Review those with your crew. Maybe take a moment to talk about the 18 watch-out situations or the 10 standard firefighting orders. This is a time for them to hear from you what your expectations are, what we're faced with, and what we're going to do in the situation where we may have to retreat. Do they know where their safety zones are? They should, and this is where you're going to give them that opportunity to learn that. Ensure that the occupants are apprised of the most current evacuation orders. They may not know. Maybe the sheriffs or the law enforcement community hasn't gotten up to that area yet, and they are just as surprised about the fire as you are. Let them know what the current evacuation orders are. Tell them that it may be a good idea for them to evacuate, or they're safe where they're at. But get that information from your division supervisor, whoever you're reporting to. They'll have the most current information as far as evacuations. And make sure that the occupants of the structures you're protecting are aware of that. Quickly survey the surrounding structures and area. You've looked at just the house. Is there a barn, a garage, a shed attached to this, or not attached but on the same property? How close is this structure to the structure next door? Are these issues I'm going to be faced with if the fire comes through here? Now that you've done all this, the next thing you're going to do is start advancing some hose lines. Advance 2.5-inch hand lines in the direction the fire is coming around each side of the structure. But don't exceed 200 feet. Most of our pre-connects are within 150 to 200 feet. Don't add on to that. You don't want to add more hose than you need, because you don't want to pick it up in a hurry if you have to. Now that we've advanced our hose lines around the structure, one on each side, again, I want to remind you, this is not to exceed 100 or 200 feet. These are 150 foot to 200 foot pre-connects, 1.5 inches, 1 3/4 around the sides of the structures towards the back. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to ladder the structure. Remember we talked about earlier when we were pre-treating and preparing the structure, we used the ladder that the homeowners had. If we've already done that, it's there. Once we establish that ladder to the roof, let's get a hose line to the roof. And it can be something as simple as a booster line. Just to protect the roof, to keep it wet, if there's any fire brands, if we have a spotting fire or situation coming through, that we can have somebody up there just keeping tabs on what's going on in the roof. Again, we talked about earlier placing a garden hose into the tank of your engine just to keep it filled up, and it provides you some water. It's not a lot, it's not a fire hydrant, but it provides you some water there. Pull a hose line. Again, it may be another booster line. You may have a smaller section of 1.5-inch line to protect your apparatus. You have a very expensive fire apparatus here, and as the fire moves through the area, you want to protect that apparatus, because remember, it's your way out. So protect that apparatus. And if you can't protect the apparatus, you probably may not need to be there in the first place. Be prepared at all times to pick up and redeploy your hose line as the threat passes. Or in the event that you're not able to deal with the fire conditions that you're presented with. And sometimes that redeploying is nothing more than picking up your hose and putting them on the engine and moving on to the next structure. Sometimes you're going to be in a hurry and you're just going to take the nozzle and appliances off your hose and leave your hose there and disconnect it from the apparatus and move on to the next one. And we'll talk about that more a little later. But always be ready to move out if you need to move out, because the fire has moved on, is now threatening another structure, or you're in a situation that's untenable and you need to leave. Let's talk a little bit about mobility. Your ability to move out of the area and if you need to. First thing we talked about a little bit before is we want to limit our hose lines to 200 feet. Which will never allow our companies to be tied down with a hose line over 200 feet. If you must retreat in a hurry, leave your hose lines. We talked about this just a moment ago. If it's possible, take your fittings and your nozzles and things like that, but leave the hose. You have enough hose on your apparatus, and they have enough hose on other apparatus that you can redeploy hose to your apparatus. Fire hose is not worth your crew's life. And it's tough to do, but if you have to get out of there in a hurry, leave the hose. Take the nozzles. You might find those helpful later. All hose lines should be taken off the same side of the apparatus and shouldn't block egress. Obviously, don't put a hose line in front of your engine, but take them off all off of one side of the apparatus, typically towards the structure you're protecting, and run them around towards the back of the structure. Again, we talked about the roof may be protected by the pre-placement of a hose line, or in some cases, the resident's garden hose. You will even find that some residents have thought about this before you got there and have already plumbed their roof with sprinkler systems. If you're fortunate enough to have that situation, turn on the sprinkler system. A hose line should always be available for the protection of the apparatus. Again, I mentioned this earlier, but it's important to revisit that if you can't protect your apparatus, which is your means of getting out of there if you have to in a hurry, then you're going to have a problem. So pull a booster line, give it to the engineer, or just have it readily available if that fire gets close to your engine that you can start cooling it off. And in large-scale incidents, and if you're fortunate enough to have the resources to do that, and you have more than one structure within your subdivision that you're protecting, and you've had the time to go to those structures beforehand, maybe you've set up hose lines already around the structure and just left them on the ground. So if you want to bump up after this structure and move to the next one, you back into the driveway, hook the pre-placed hose lines to your engine, take the nozzles and fittings that you've taken from the previous house and hook them to your hose line, and you're all ready to go. This is really great technique in large-scale subdivisions if you want to bump and run. I want to take care of this structure. When it passes, now I can go over to this structure, and my hose placement is already there. When we first started talking about structural protection, one of the things we were going to talk about is the methods of confronting the fire once it gets to the structure. And there's 4 different methods that you might want to consider. One, you may be faced with a spotting situation. You may be able to contain the fire fully before it ever gets to the structure. You may be only able to do a partial containment of the fire before it gets to the structure, or there's just no containment possible, and you're going to have to do what you can with the fire as it reaches your structure. Let's start off by talking about the spotting situations. The biggest problem with spot fires is extinguishing the fire brands before they start a larger fire. So if you have a fire, a wildland fire, that is causing trees to torch and putting up a lot of firebrands in the air, and you have the winds to carry those firebrands, and this is information you're going to want to know when you check in, that has the fire been spotting? And how far has it been spotting? A wildland fire that's spotting 1 mile to 2 ahead of itself is a significant fire, and it brings certain dangers to it. And one of the things you want to make sure you know is how far that is spotting. Attempt to extinguish all spot fires as quickly as possible before they grow. Remember, we're in a dry situation where the weather is conducive for wildland fires. And because of that, we can have these little brands create larger fires ahead of us or behind us or all around us. If you find yourself in a spot fire situation, make sure you have a lookout in place. Commit one of your people on your apparatus to do nothing more than just be the eyes for you, looking around and protecting your back. They'll be able to see what's going on around them. They'll be able to see if a fire or spot fire is growing and cutting off your ability to get out of the area. A lot of fire companies and firefighters, whether it's wildland or structural, have been caught because of spot fires have gone ahead of them and cut off their ways to get out of the fire area. Have a lookout available to you to pay attention to your 6. Always watch your back. The second method I want to talk about is containing the fire fully, either extinguishing it or controlling the fire as it approaches the structure you're protecting. Hopefully you find yourself in this situation, because if you're able to contain the fire and extinguish what you're being presented with, then you're probably operating in a situation where there are relatively light fuels, low intensity fires that you're able to get in front of and put out. You may not even need any water, or very, very little water. You may be able to get out there with a shovel, some hand tools, and scratch out a fire line and remove that fuel, and so the fire just diminishes. Hopefully the property owner has a nice green space against their structure, so the fire will die down. You won't have to deal with it, and you're able to fully contain the fire before it ever reaches the structure. The next method we're going to talk about is partial containment. It's used when you're not able to put out the entire fire, put out the fire that's approaching the structure. This carries the most risk to your firefighters. The fire's not able to be stopped. You're going to have to move the fire around the structure. Remember we talked about earlier where you pulled a hose line around each side of the structure and you now have them both connected at the back of the building? This is where you're going to get your firefighters on the backside on those hose lines, and you're going to meet the fire as it comes to you. Now, obviously, if the intensity is such that you can't withstand the heat or the fire's moving too fast, you may want to consider moving to the next phase we're going to talk about. But if you're able to partially contain the fire, put your firefighters on those hose lines. And as the fire hits the property, start extinguishing the fire. And move along the property line around the structure and push that fire away from the structure and slow it down, cool it off, and hit the main front of the fire as it comes to your structure. And once you get around the structure, now you're going to move back the other direction and put out those spot fires and really extinguish that. And this is what we call partially containing the fire. You're just moving the direction of the fire. You're putting out the leading edge of the fire, because remember, behind that leading edge is already burnt area. So it shouldn't burn again. Or hopefully it's burnt clean enough that you don't have any more fuels there. We just talked about standing in front of it, moving a fire heading towards you and moving it around structures with 2.5-inch lines. A pretty daunting task if you think about it. And one that most firefighters don't have a lot of experience at if they don't do this on a regular basis. These are scary situations. These are situations you're not faced with on a regular basis that are going to put your firefighters on edge. You as the company officer needs to be aware of this. You need to be right there with them. You need to be directing their efforts, and you need to be ensuring them that they're doing the right things and they're doing it safely. Once you get that fire moved around you, and then clean up those spots back to your point of where you started, then you can move on to the structure and check for any extension to the house, check for any extension to the roof, or whatever. But once the fire passes, then you're now able to move on to the next structure. But remember, as a company officer, you may have more experience at this than your firefighters. You need to be there to reassure them and help them through this process. And the last mode I want to talk about, and when you're confronting the fire at your structure, is the no containment possible mode. This should be in a very large or very fast moving fire that you're not able to stand in front of it with your hose lines and affect the outcome of the fire. But I want to point out, this is a very dangerous mode to the firefighters. You must, underscore must, bold big letters, must, have a safety zone identified and are ready to retreat if it should become necessary. Do not stay in this situation if you can't affect a positive outcome for the structure. And don't underestimate this situation before it happens. What I'm saying is, if you think you're going to be faced with a situation where you're not able to contain the fire and there's no possible containment available or able to be mounted, then maybe the best course of action is hopefully your pre-treatment and all the work you did before you got there, or the homeowner did before they got there, is enough to protect the structure, and you just leave. Sometimes the best offense is a good defense, and you get back in there after the fire's moved through and put the fire out if the structure is burning on the exterior or it's burning in the grass. But don't stand there and wait for that to happen. Get out of there if you have to. The objective here is to cool the structure to withstand the heat as the fire passes. And remember, depending on what fuels you have that are burning around here, you may have some pretty intense heat. And so a couple of hose lines, a couple of 1.5-inch hoses aren't going to be able to do it. Also take into consideration your water supply. If you only have 1,000 gallons on your engine or less, if you're dealing with that much heat, you're going to put a lot of water on this building in order to keep it cool. You may not have enough, and what you don't want to do is run out of water. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but always save about 100 gallons of water in your engine for you. Give the other 90% to everybody else, but keep 10% for yourself just in case you may need it. I want to reiterate and bring up again. Do not stay longer than is safe. Retreat to your safety zone with plenty of time to do so. All too often, we wait that last little moment because we can get a hook on this fire and we can take care of it, and we don't want to leave something unattended. But don't do that at the expense of your own safety. Make sure you have enough time to get to your safety zone. Make sure you've pulled the plug and you've gotten your people out there when it's appropriate to do so. Also, as company officers, you've been continually monitoring the fire and the area that you're in. Make sure that if Plan B doesn't work, Plan C does. Have more than one way out if you need to. If this is a congested area where there's maybe a lot of traffic or a poor road system, look at the best way out. And maybe your Plan B has been cut off by the fire, and so you need to go to Plan C. But always have a way out. And if you're worried about going to Plan C, you probably shouldn't have been there anyway, if the fire is that intense. So again, don't stay longer than you need to. Make sure you get your people out with enough time to safely do so. And lastly, with any structural firefighting method or attack, you might deploy more than one of these modes in order to handle or mitigate the problem. If you're faced with a situation where you think you can contain the fire before it gets there and it moves to a partial containment, or maybe you started with a partial containment and you were more successful than you anticipated and you move back to a fully containment mode. You can employ whatever mode or whatever you need to in order to take care of the problem. Make sure throughout this whole process of confronting the fire at the structure, you have a good grasp on the situational awareness. The situational awareness 6 hours earlier when you arrived at this subdivision may have changed. So constantly update your situational awareness. Make sure that you're aware of what's going on while you're fighting the fire. Remember, while you're engaged in the fire attack and you're facing the fire, things are changing around you. So this is why that constant grasp on your situational awareness, that use of a lookout to look at your six and find out what's going on behind you is very important. You're going to concentrate on the problem facing you, not where you're going to be going in the future. So always maintain that situational awareness and be aware of that. And the last subject I want to talk about on structural fire protection is that of retreat. Don't overstay your ability to safely meet your objectives. Remember, as a company officer, your job is not only to protect your people and direct their actions and their firefighting efforts. You're looking at the big picture. You're looking at where the fire's been, where it's going to go, the hazards around you, everything it takes so you can let these guys concentrate on doing their job. Your job is the big picture. And sometimes that big picture is going to tell you this isn't safe to be here. And the best course of action here is to get out of here. Don't underestimate that. That's huge. And firefighters have been seriously injured because they haven't heeded that warning. If you need to get out of there, retreat. Fall back to a safety zone. Pull back to a point where you safely can monitor what the fire is doing as it passes, and then come back in and pick up what's left over. When you've determined the best course of action is to retreat, take care in doing so. Remember, other companies in the area may be doing the same thing at the same time. Civilians may still be operating in the area as they move out. Those people were the holdouts that said they were going to stay through at all costs, maybe have thought better of that now and are leaving with you. Your egress may have changed. You may be posed with fire conditions that weren't there when you just find this is the best way to get out. But at all costs, while you're making these decisions, the company officer needs to maintain, again, their situational awareness as they're leaving the area. Because once you leave, it's going to look different when you come back in. So maintain that situational awareness. Maintain that ability to know what is happening at the fire as you leave. Up to this point, we've talked about structural protection, whether it was preparing the structure for the fire before it gets there or protecting the structure once the fire gets there. I want to switch gears a little bit. Well, I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about wildland fires and how to successfully mitigate those fires, because that's a whole other class in itself. I want to touch on it because all too often the structural community has gone to these fires with the thinking that their responsibility is to the structure and the structure alone, to protect the structure against the fire by conventional methods that we just talked about. More and more, we're understanding that if we can do something to mitigate the wildland fire before it ever gets to the structure, then our structural protection needs are much less. So that's what we want to talk about now. Many structural fire departments are becoming increasingly more involved in the suppression of wildland fires. And there are two significant ways to attack these fires we're going to talk about. One is the direct attack, and the other is the indirect attack. Let's talk about the first method, and that is of direct attack, where you offensively attack the fire directly. This method works great on fires that are burning light fuels, on low intensity, where firefighters are able to access the fuel and access the fire safely right in front of it. Direct attack usually begins by selecting an anchor point and advancing hand lines directly around the edges or the perimeter of the fire. The flames are knocked down with water or throwing dirt on the fire. Crews then follow up behind by scraping out the vegetation to the mineral soil along the edge of the fire. So again, you're starting at an anchor point, and you're moving on the right and left flank of the fire, sometimes with hose and water, and sometimes with hand tools, if hand tools are appropriate given the fire intensity. But the first run is you're knocking the fire down, and then followed up by hand crews where we're digging the soil down to mineral earth and removing all the fuel. And the second method we want to talk about when confronting the wildland fire is the indirect method. And this is what's commonly used on large-scale wildland fires, the forest fires, if you will, that you see on the TV. Where you're not able to meet the fire at its head and put it out, you go to the indirect method, where you may use a road system where you're burning off of that road to remove the fuels. You may use dozers to scrape out a line 2 or 3 dozer widths wide, far ahead of the advancing fire. So when it gets to that point, it runs out of fuel and subsequently slows down and dies, and you're able to get in there and then start employing the direct attack. The indirect method is very successful. This is where you see the use of borate bombers and air attack crews where they're putting out retardant lines all the way around the fire. There's a very quick approach to wildland firefighting. And to understand the direct and indirect attack requires many classroom hours and practical experience to do so. You're going to be working under the direction of most likely a wildland firefighter or a wildland officer who's going to direct these options. One of the things I want to stress is that don't be surprised if we move away from the conventional protecting the structure into the forest a little more to see if we can slow the progression of the fire before it gets to our structure. And you may use either one of these two methods to do so. I know we've covered a lot of material here, and hopefully it's been valuable material for you. I want to end with a couple of things. One is paramount to any operation within the wildland-urban interface zone is safety of your firefighters. Recognizing that they're the number one priority that you have. That on every fire situation, it doesn't change whether it's in the city or in the rural. Safety of our personnel is paramount. Secondly, understanding the situation you're faced with and being able to make good, sound decisions based on that information and based on that situation you find. Hopefully, as this last slide shows, that maybe the homeowners, and quite common within the urban interface areas throughout the nation, are programs like FireWise or community wildland protection programs, where homeowners recognize the potential threat of wildland fires to their property. And they've taken steps ahead of you, ahead of the fire, to go out there and mitigate the problem, to remove the brush, to fix their roofs, to take away and create a nice green space that won't burn, using non-flammable vegetation. Hopefully you've gotten a community, and one of the best ways we can fight these fires is encourage our communities to pay attention to the wildland-urban interface fires and where they live and do what they can do before the fire ever happens. It'll make your job a lot easier.